The abandoned alien. The battlefield was silent. Not the kind of silence that brought peace, but the kind that followed destruction. Smoke curled from the wreckage of Silari warships, their once mighty hulls reduced to twisted metal. The ground was scorched black from orbital strikes, the air thick with the scent of burning alloys and charred flesh. Commander Syra lay among the ruins, her breathing shallow, her body refusing to move. She had fought until the last moment, her twin plasma blades cutting through enemy ranks with the precision of a seasoned warrior. But it hadn't been enough. The enemy's final strike had sent her crashing into the rubble, her body battered, her armor cracked, and her pride shattered. She could hear the distant hum of departing warships. The Silari fleet was leaving. Her people were abandoning this place. They were abandoning her. She gritted her teeth, trying to push herself up, but pain lanced through her side. Her own body had betrayed her. She was no longer fit for battle. And in the eyes of the Silari, an injured warrior was no warrior at all. Their code was clear. If you couldn't stand, you weren't worth saving. Her vision blurred as she looked toward the sky, watching the last of the Silari ships vanish into the void. They had left without hesitation. No search parties, no rescue teams, no final words. She was already dead to them. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, though it quickly turned into a cough, thick with blood. So this was how it ended. Not in the heat of battle, not in glorious combat, but alone, discarded, forgotten. But then something strange happened. A distant rumble echoed across the wasteland, growing louder with each passing second. Syra forced herself to turn her head, scanning the horizon. At first, she thought it was her failing vision, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But no, there it was, real and unmistakable. A ship. It wasn't Silari. Its design was too crude, too simple. Its movements weren't as fluid as a Silari warship, but there was a strange efficiency to it, a controlled descent that spoke of careful precision rather than brute force. The ship landed near the wreckage, its thrusters kicking up a storm of dust. Syra's instincts flared. Had the enemy returned to finish the job? Was this a scavenger looking for tech to strip from fallen warriors? Her hand reached for the plasma blade at her side. It barely flickered to life, its energy core damaged from the battle. Still, she tightened her grip. If this was her end, she would not meet it as a helpless corpse. The ship's ramp lowered with a hiss and a figure emerged. Not Silari. Not a species she recognized immediately. Then it hit her, a human. Syra's muscles tensed. The war had largely ignored their kind, the humans playing no major role in the galactic conflict. They were a minor species, barely acknowledged by the Silari as anything more than background noise in the grander schemes of war. And yet, here one stood, in the middle of a battlefield he had no business being on. He was tall, wearing a simple yet functional flight suit. His face was unreadable, his movements careful, as if assessing the wreckage. He didn't seem to be searching for weapons or technology. He was looking for something else, or someone. His gaze landed on her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, to her utter shock, he walked toward her. Syra's grip on her weapon tightened, every instinct screaming at her to attack. Humans were weak. That was what the Silari always said. But this one didn't move like prey. He moved with purpose. She forced herself onto her knees, her battered body protesting. She would not go down without a fight. The human stopped just a few feet away. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't flinch at her hostile gaze. Instead, he crouched slightly, tilting his head as if studying her injuries. And then, in a voice far too calm for the situation, he said, "You look like you could use some help." Syra froze. It wasn't just the words that unsettled her, it was the tone. There was no mockery, no condescension, no arrogance, only genuine concern. Why? Why would a human, an enemy, offer assistance? She bared her teeth in a snarl, lifting her blade. I don't need help from your kind. The human sighed, looking unimpressed. Yeah, well, your kind left you here to die. The words hit like a physical blow. Syra's grip faltered, just for a second. The human took a slow step forward. You can try to kill me, he said, completely unafraid. Or you can let me patch you up and live to fight another day. She should have killed him. Right there. Ended the insult of his presence with one last desperate strike. But she didn't. And she hated herself for hesitating. The pain was unbearable, but not nearly as unbearable as the humiliation. Sarah had been taught since childhood that a true warrior never faltered, never accepted weakness. And yet here she was, barely clinging to consciousness while an enemy, a human, stood over her, offering aid like she was some pathetic wounded creature in need of saving. She forced herself to move, pushing her body up with what little strength she had left. The ruined battlefield around them spun in her vision, the wreckage of fallen ships and the charred remains of warriors blurring together in a dizzying haze. The human stood motionless, waiting. He hadn't drawn a weapon. That was the strangest part. In all her years of combat, she had never met an enemy who hesitated to strike when given an opening. This human had every advantage. She was weak, injured, barely able to lift her blade. And yet he had not taken the opportunity to kill her. Why? Syra clenched her jaw, steadying herself as best she could. The plasma blade in her grip flickered weakly, its energy failing. It didn't matter. She still had her hands, her claws, her teeth. If this human thought she would allow herself to be captured or pitied, he was a fool. She lunged. Her movement was sluggish, uncoordinated, but she put everything she had into it. Her claws slashed through the air, aiming for his throat. But the human dodged. Not in a panicked, clumsy way, as she expected. He sidestepped with fluid precision, moving just enough to evade her strike without retreating. She struck again. This time, he caught her wrist. A mistake. She bared her fangs and twisted, attempting to throw him off balance, to drive her knee into his ribs, to force him into a proper fight. But he was faster. Before she could react, he shifted his weight, using her own momentum against her. In a blink, she found herself slammed back down into the dirt, her limbs pinned beneath his grip. Humiliation burned through her. How? How could a human, one of the weakest species, move like that? How could he predict her attacks, counter them so effortlessly? She struggled, thrashing beneath him, but he held firm, not with brute strength, but with a calm, practiced efficiency. He wasn't overpowering her. He was outmaneuvering her. Her breath came in ragged bursts as her vision darkened at the edges. The pain, the exhaustion, the disgrace of being overpowered by a human. It was too much. Are you done? His voice was steady, completely devoid of mockery. She hissed, her pride demanding she fight, that she tear this arrogant creature apart with her last breath. But her body had reached its limit. She couldn't keep going. Not like this. He must have noticed, because he let out a breath and released his grip, stepping back. She expected him to take advantage of her weakened state, to bind her, imprison her, perhaps even execute her. Instead, he offered her his hand. She stared at it like it was a foreign object, something utterly incomprehensible. "You're going to die if you stay here," he said, "and from what I can tell, your people aren't coming back for you." She flinched. The words struck deeper than she cared to admit. Still, she bared her teeth. "I don't need your help, human." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "That's funny," he said, "because right now you look like someone who has exactly two choices: accept help or die alone." Syra wanted to spit in his face. She wanted to curse him, to remind him that his kind were nothing in the grand scale of war, that the Xelari had never feared humans, never even considered them a real threat. And yet, she was the one dying in the dirt. And this human was the only one who had stopped to help. Her entire life, she had been taught that a warrior's fate was to fight until the last breath, That honor came in the form of glorious death on the battlefield. But this wasn't glory. This was being discarded. She glanced at his ship. It was smaller than an auxiliary warship, its design less advanced, but it was intact, fully operational. It was a way out. The human watched her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't begging her. He wasn't demanding anything. He was simply offering. For reasons she couldn't understand, that infuriated her more than anything else. With a growl of frustration, she grabbed his arm. A strange look passed over his face. Not victory, not smugness, but something else. Something unreadable. He pulled her up in one swift motion, his grip strong but careful. As soon as she was on her feet, her body nearly collapsed again, her legs trembling. Before she could fall, he caught her, looping one of her arms over his shoulder. "Easy," he muttered. "Let's get you inside before more of your people show up and shoot us both." She stiffened. "My people wouldn't waste their firepower on you." He snorted. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not test that theory." She had no argument for that. With each step, she felt her pride crumbling, piece by piece. She, Commander Syra of the Auxiliary, was being carried by a human. She didn't know whether to hate him more for saving her life, or for proving her wrong. The hum of the ship's engines was the first thing Syra registered as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The steady, rhythmic vibration against the floor beneath her body was unfamiliar, too smooth, and too quiet to belong to any auxiliary vessel. It wasn't a warship. It wasn't a transport. It wasn't home. Her eyes flickered open, adjusting to the dim artificial lighting overhead. The air was crisp and filtered, carrying none of the battlefield's metallic stench of blood and burning wreckage. For a brief, disoriented moment, she thought she had been taken by an enemy faction, held prisoner in some foreign medical bay. Then she remembered. The human. Her body tensed instantly, a warrior's instinct refusing to let her guard down, but the movement sent a sharp bolt of pain through her side. She hissed, her muscles locking up as she realized just how broken she was. Her armor had been removed, leaving her in the damaged undersuit she had worn beneath it. Bandages, actual bandages, had been wrapped around her wounds, clean and precise, unlike the crude battlefield seals she was used to. Her gaze darted around the room. Small, compact, functional. It wasn't a medical bay. It was a crew quarters, hastily repurposed for treatment. There was a single metal cot, barely large enough to accommodate her auxiliary frame, a locked storage compartment, and a cramped console embedded into the wall. A survivalist's ship, not a military-grade vessel. And sitting across from her, leaning back against the opposite wall with his arms folded, was him. The human. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. His jacket was unzipped, his flight suit still dusty from the battlefield. But he didn't look concerned. If anything, he seemed like a man used to waiting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Syra inhaled slowly, controlling her rage, her humiliation, the unbearable feeling of vulnerability that burned beneath her skin. She should have been dead, left to die like every other fallen warrior. Instead, she was here, on a human ship, because of him. "You're awake," he said finally. His voice was calm, but not soft, not cautious. It lacked the kind of condescension she had expected. He wasn't treating her like an invalid. He was just stating a fact. She sat up slowly, her muscles resisting the movement, and swung her legs over the edge of the cot. She expected him to stop her, to force her back down, but he didn't. He just watched. "Where am I?" she demanded. "My ship," he replied. She resisted the urge to sneer. "And why am I here?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he shrugged. "Because I didn't feel like letting you die." Her claws dug into the edge of the cot. That was not an answer. "You should have," she said, voice tight. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I didn't." She hated how nonchalant he was. He had no idea what he had done, what kind of disgrace he had put upon her. Xelari warriors who were saved by outsiders, by enemies, were seen as nothing. Worse than the dead, they were traitors to their own fate. He should have killed her, or left her. But instead, he had done something far worse. He had helped, and she didn't understand why. She studied him carefully, taking in his features. The short, dark hair, the unshaven stubble along his jaw, the weary but sharp look in his eyes, like someone who had seen enough battlefields to know when to take a fight and when to walk away from one. He was no soldier, not like her. He lacked the rigid discipline of an army-trained warrior, but he was dangerous in a different way. There was something in the way he moved, the way he had fought her so easily on the battlefield. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster. He wasn't better. But he had anticipated her. He had read her. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictability was deadly. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she ignored it. She had survived worse conditions. She wouldn't show weakness, not here, not in front of him. Unfortunately, the human noticed. He stood without a word, stepping past her toward the small cooking unit mounted in the corner of the room. She expected him to grab a ration pack, primitive human food, bland and processed. Instead, he pulled out a small metal container, popped the seal, and within seconds, the smell of heated food filled the room. Her body betrayed her before she could suppress it. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Her throat tightened. It smelled good. Not like nutrient blocks or military rations. Not stale or over-processed. It smelled fresh. The human glanced over his shoulder, clearly aware of her reaction, but not commenting on it. He simply grabbed a second container and walked back, handing it to her without a word. She stared at it, unmoving. "I'm not your prisoner," she said, her voice like a blade. "No," he agreed, "but you are injured, and you need food to heal." Her claws tightened around the container, but she still didn't move to open it. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to throw it back at him, to remind him that she wasn't like him, that she didn't need his kindness or his pity. But her body had other plans. Her stomach clenched painfully, and before she could stop herself, she cracked open the container. The food inside was simple. Grains, protein, something she couldn't quite identify, but smelled rich and full of flavor. She lifted it cautiously, taking a bite. Her entire body went still. It was good. Better than any military rations she had ever eaten. It was hot, seasoned, balanced, real. She despised how quickly she took a second bite. The human smirked slightly but said nothing, simply eating his own portion in silence. The quiet stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, after several long moments, she swallowed and set the empty container aside. Her sharp eyes locked onto his. "You could have left me there," she said. "I could have," he agreed. She exhaled slowly, trying to find the words that didn't make her feel like she was betraying herself. "Why?" He leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. There was no hesitation in his answer. "Because I don't leave people behind." Something in her stopped. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Like it was a rule, a law, something so deeply ingrained in his being that it wasn't even a question. She had spent her entire life in an army that believed in leaving the weak behind, in culling the wounded, in discarding anyone who couldn't keep up. And here was a human, a species her people had always deemed insignificant, who saw all of that as unthinkable. For the first time since waking up, she didn't know how to respond. The hum of the ship's engines became a steady rhythm beneath Syra's feet, a constant reminder that she was no longer on Xelari ground. Every breath she took was tainted by unfamiliarity, sterilized air, artificial gravity slightly weaker than what she was used to, and the lingering scent of human food clinging to the walls of the cramped ship. It was small, far smaller than any Xelari warcraft, but it was efficient. Every piece of equipment had a purpose, every control panel was within arm's reach, every inch of space was maximized. It was a survivalist's vessel, not a warship. She didn't belong here, but her body, still weak and recovering, betrayed her. She had eaten the human's food. She had accepted his medical aid. And now she stood inside his ship, alive because of him. Her pride curdled in her chest. She focused her gaze on him, watching as he moved around the cockpit with an ease that came from familiarity. He wasn't like the disciplined auxiliary officers she had trained under, whose movements were precise and efficient. His steps were loose, his posture relaxed, yet there was an underlying sharpness to him, a quiet awareness of his surroundings that told her he was always ready. He was no soldier, but he had seen combat. Syra had seen men like this before: pilots, scouts, smugglers, the kind of people who weren't part of any grand army, but still survived in the chaos of war. "You've been staring at me for a while," the human said without turning around. "Planning to kill me." She tensed slightly but didn't look away, still considering it. He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissive. "Appreciate the honesty," he said, tapping a few buttons on the console. "But you might want to hold off on that. We got bigger problems." Syra's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The human, Daniel, as he had finally introduced himself, tilted his head toward the viewport. Syra followed his gaze, stepping closer to see past the reinforced glass. What she saw sent a slow, creeping chill down her spine. In the distance, cutting through the void like a silent executioner, was an auxiliary scout ship. It was smaller than the warships she was used to, designed for reconnaissance rather than battle, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Auxiliary scouts weren't there to fight. They were there to hunt. If that ship was here, it meant only one thing. They were searching for survivors. Daniel watched her carefully, studying her reaction. "I take it that's not a good sign." She forced herself to stand straight despite the sharp pull of her healing wounds. "If they find us, they will kill you and take me prisoner." He raised an eyebrow. "Not rescue you." Syra's jaw clenched. She didn't answer. Daniel nodded to himself, as if he had expected that. "Right. Then I guess we better not let them find us." Syra turned back to the viewport, calculating. The scout ship was moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, scanning the battlefield for any signs of life. If it got close enough, it would detect the human's vessel. "You need to move," she said. "I'm aware," he replied, already flipping switches and adjusting the ship's trajectory. The engines thrummed softly, and the ship began to drift away from the debris field, slipping into the shadow of a ruined auxiliary warship. Daniel navigated with the kind of skill that only came from years of experience, weaving through the wreckage like he had done this 100 times before. Syra was forced to admit he was good. She watched in silence as he worked, but her mind was racing. The auxiliary ship wouldn't stop until it had finished its sweep. If they stayed hidden long enough, it might move on. But if the human made one mistake, if he left even the slightest energy signature behind. The comm system crackled to life. Her blood ran cold. A voice, sharp and commanding, spoke in auxiliary through the ship's speakers. "Unknown vessel, identify yourself." Syra's body went rigid. The scout ship had detected them. Daniel muttered something under his breath and switched off the outbound comms. "I'm guessing pretending to be friendly isn't gonna work." "No," Syra said flatly. He exhaled through his nose, thinking. "Right. Plan B, then." Before she could ask what Plan B was, he suddenly killed the ship's engines. Syra's claws dug into the armrest beside her. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Making us look dead," he said, voice calm. "If I try to run, they'll chase us. If I power down, they might think we're just wreckage." Syra wanted to argue, but his logic wasn't entirely flawed. Auxiliary scouts didn't waste time investigating dead ships. They only focused on the living. Still, it was a gamble. A dangerous one. The minutes stretched painfully. The scout ship hovered in the distance, its scanners sweeping over them. Syra could feel the tension radiating from Daniel, though he kept his face unreadable. They waited. The auxiliary ship drifted closer. Syra barely breathed. The ship's shadow loomed over them. Then, a long, tense silence. And then the scout ship began to turn away. Syra's breath escaped her in a slow, measured exhale. Daniel didn't move, his fingers hovering over the controls, waiting. Only when the auxiliary ship finally disappeared into the darkness did he flick the engines back online. "Well," he said, stretching his shoulders. "That was fun." Syra shot him a glare. "You are insane." He grinned. Probably. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him how reckless his plan had been, how easily they could have been killed. But the words didn't come. Because, for the first time, she was starting to realize something. Daniel Carter didn't think like auxiliary. He didn't rely on brute force, on overwhelming strength or rigid tactics. He adapted. And, for the first time, Syra wondered if that was why humans survived wars they had no business surviving. Perhaps they weren't weak. Perhaps they were just different. And that made them dangerous. The silence between them stretched long after the auxiliary scout ship had disappeared into the void. Syra still felt its presence, a phantom weight pressing against her instincts, telling her that her people were still out there, hunting, watching. And if they ever found her aboard this human ship, they would not ask questions. They would not take prisoners. They would kill him without hesitation. She should have let them. That was the thought twisting in her mind like a blade. She should have left him to die, let the auxiliary find her, and take her back to whatever fate awaited the dishonored and the weak. That was the way of her people. And yet, she was still here. Daniel exhaled and leaned back in his seat, rubbing his hands over his face. "Well, that was stressful," he muttered. "But I'd say we handled it pretty well." Syra turned her gaze toward him, unreadable. "We." He grinned slightly. "Yeah, we. You were part of the plan, too." She bristled at that. "I did nothing." "Exactly. You trusted me enough to do nothing. That counts for something." She didn't know whether to growl in frustration or scoff at his absurd logic. Trust. She didn't trust him. She barely tolerated him. She had simply chosen the option that gave her the best chance of survival. That wasn't trust, it was strategy. And yet, something about the way he said it made her uneasy. She had trusted no one in her life. Not truly. Not even her own people. The auxiliary did not rely on one another. They fought beside one another. Yes, but the second you fell, you became irrelevant. Warriors did not expect to be saved. They did not expect a second chance. And yet here was this human, acting as though saving people was just something he did. "You should not have risked your life for me," she said at last. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's the second time you've said that. I'm starting to think you actually mean it." She narrowed her eyes. "I do." He sighed, as if he had expected this argument, then stood from his seat and stretched. "Well, I did anyway, so I guess we're both just gonna have to live with that." Syra watched him carefully, trying to understand the why of him. He was not a warrior, yet he had fought. He was not reckless, yet he had risked himself for a stranger. Nothing about him made sense. "You did not have to help me," she said. "Nope," he agreed. "You gained nothing from it." "Pretty much." She folded her arms, her claws tapping against the metal plating of her forearm. "Then why?" Daniel considered her for a moment, then shrugged. "Because leaving people to die is just not what I do." Syra scowled. "That is weakness." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Yeah. Tell that to the people who are still alive because of it." She stiffened. There was something there. A history behind those words, something unspoken but heavy. She recognized the weight of experience in his voice. The same weight she had heard in the voices of battle-worn auxiliary veterans, the ones who had seen too much, lost too much. Daniel Carter had lost people before. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. He moved toward the back of the ship, clearly unbothered by the tension in the air. "You should get some rest," he said over his shoulder. "We've got a long trip ahead of us." Syra frowned. "Trip?" He nodded. "Yeah, I need to get to a neutral station, somewhere I can refuel and maybe figure out what the hell to do with you." Her muscles tensed. A station. That was dangerous. "Your people will be watching neutral zones," she said. "If they recognize me." "They won't." She narrowed her eyes. "You cannot guarantee that." "No, but I can make sure you don't go walking and looking like a auxiliary warrior fresh off the battlefield." Her claws flexed against her palm. She did not like the sound of that. "I will not disguise myself like a coward." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're not a coward. You're a survivor. And right now, surviving means not letting your people recognize you on sight." Syra bristled at the word survivor. It was an insult among her kind. It implied someone who lived through a battle rather than died in victory. And yet, she was alive. A living contradiction to everything she had been raised to believe. She hated it. But she hated the idea of dying even more. She exhaled slowly. What kind of disguise? Daniel smirked, and that was the first sign she had made a mistake. A few hours later, she stood in front of the ship's small reflective panel, glaring at her own humiliation. Gone was her battered auxiliary armor, replaced with civilian clothes. Simple, functional, human. Daniel had wrapped fabric around her head to hide the ridges along her scalp, and he had even found tinted lenses to obscure the glow of her eyes. She looked ridiculous. She turned sharply to Daniel, baring her teeth. "I will kill you for this." He grinned. "Now see. That's why we gotta work on your expressions. If you glare at everyone like that, people are gonna notice." Syra was going to kill him. But the moment she thought it, she felt something strange. Something she hadn't felt since before the war had begun. A flicker of something close to amusement. She scowled, pushing the feeling away. Daniel leaned against the control panel, studying her. "You know," he said, "you could just stay here, on the ship, safer that way." Syra stiffened. The idea was logical, smart. It would minimize risk. And yet, some part of her rejected it instantly. She had been abandoned once. She had been left behind. She would never let that happen again. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin. "No," she said firmly. "I will go with you." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right then. Welcome to the human side of things." She scoffed, folding her arms. "Do not expect me to act like one of you." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said with a grin. "But for the next few hours, try not to stab anyone." Syra rolled her eyes. No promises. And with that, she followed him toward the ship's exit, stepping into a world that was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The neutral station was unlike anything Syra had ever seen before. It wasn't built for war. It wasn't sleek and efficient like an auxiliary stronghold or a Terran military outpost. It was chaotic, a sprawling collection of docks, market stalls, neon-lit corridors, and patched-together starships, all orbiting a dying star like a civilization clinging to life. The moment she stepped off the human ship, her instincts screamed at her to be on guard. This was not enemy territory, but it was not safe either. The air smelled of fuel and sweat, of too many species packed into too little space. Voices in a dozen languages clashed against one another, merchants haggling, smugglers whispering, bounty hunters watching from the shadows. Syra's muscles tensed beneath the fabric of her disguise. This was not her world. Daniel walked ahead of her, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. He was at home here, blending in like he had been navigating places like this his entire life. He barely glanced over his shoulder as he spoke. "Try not to look like you want to kill everyone." Syra glared at him. "I do want to kill everyone." He sighed. "Yeah, see, that's the problem." She didn't respond, but she did adjust her posture slightly, shifting into something less confrontational. It was against every instinct she had, but she understood the logic. If she drew attention, she invited danger. And right now, she could not afford danger. They moved deeper into the station, past vendor stalls selling everything from weapons to synthetic food, past docking bays where engineers yelled at impatient pilots, past dark alleyways where figures lingered just out of sight. Syra noticed everything. The exits, the vantage points, the potential threats. Daniel, however, walked like he had no fear at all. She didn't understand how he could be so calm in a place like this. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. "Supply run," he said. "Fuel, food, and some information." She frowned. Information about what? Daniel hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Then he said, "A way to get you somewhere safe." Syra's scowl deepened. "I do not need to be gotten anywhere." "Sure you do," he said, scanning the crowd. "Right now, your people think you're dead. That won't last. The second they figure out you're alive, they're gonna come looking. And I'm guessing they're not the welcome back with open arms kind of people." Her jaw tightened. He was right. The Xelari did not welcome back the abandoned. If they found her, she would not be given a second chance. She would be executed for her weakness. But the idea of hiding made her stomach turn. "I do not run," she said coldly. Daniel stopped and turned to face her. His expression wasn't mocking, wasn't amused. It was something else entirely. "You think that's what this is?" he asked. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Is it not?" He shook his head. "Running is what people do when they're afraid. This is surviving. And surviving means knowing when to pick your battles." She hated how much sense that made. Before she could respond, Daniel's eyes flickered past her, toward something in the crowd. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. His posture relaxed, his face neutral, but there was a sharpness behind his gaze that hadn't been there before. Syra didn't turn. She knew better than that. Instead, she spoke under her breath. "Who?" "3 of them," he murmured. "Across the walkway, near the vendor with the blue lights. Don't look yet." She resisted the urge to check. "What are they?" "Not Xelari. Mercenaries, from the look of them." His tone was casual, but she caught the tension beneath it. "And they're watching me. Not you." Syra frowned. "You have enemies." Daniel chuckled dryly. "Oh, tons." That should not have surprised her. She focused on what she could hear, the faint clink of armored boots, the shifting of weapons strapped to bodies. Whoever these mercenaries were, they were not just casual thugs. They were professionals. "Do they intend to kill you?" she asked. "Probably." Syra exhaled slowly. "Then I suggest we deal with them before they try." Daniel smirked. "See, I knew you'd warm up to me eventually." She resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Instead of retreating, Daniel did something unexpected. He started walking toward the mercenaries. Syra stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Getting ahead of the problem," he said. Before she could stop him, he was already weaving through the crowd, heading straight for the 3 figures who had been watching him. Syra hesitated only a moment before following. The mercenaries tensed as Daniel approached, hands drifting toward their weapons. Syra saw it immediately, the flicker of recognition in their eyes. They knew who he was, the tallest of them. A heavily scared woman with cybernetic implants along her jaw crossed her arms. "Carter." Daniel grinned. "Hey, Ayla. You look well. New face upgrades." The woman's expression darkened. "You should not be here." "Yeah, I get that a lot," he said, completely unfazed. "But see, I'm just passing through. No trouble." The second mercenary, a reptilian humanoid with dark, scaled skin, let out a low growl. "There is a price on your head." Syra's muscles coiled, ready to strike. Daniel sighed. "Isn't there always?" The third mercenary, silent until now, finally spoke. "You know the rules," he said. You walk into neutral space with a bounty this high. You don't get to walk out. Daniel glanced at Syra. See, this is why I don't make a lot of friends. Syra was done listening. She moved before the mercenaries could react, stepping in front of Daniel in a single fluid motion. Her posture was relaxed, but her stance was not. It was the stance of someone ready to kill. The leader, Ayla, narrowed her eyes. Who's this? Syra bared her teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile. The reason you will walk away. The reptilian mercenary scoffed. You think we're afraid of? Syra moved. 1 second she was still. The next she had her hand around his throat. The mercenary froze. The air around them changed instantly. The crowd continued moving, oblivious, but the mercenaries knew. They felt it. Syra could kill him right now. She leaned in slightly, voice quiet, dangerous. You do not want to test me. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Ayla lifted her hands in a slow, deliberate motion. Stand down, she told her crew. Syra released the mercenary's throat. He stumbled back, eyes wide with something close to fear. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. See, this is why we're such a great team. Syra turned to him, expression unreadable. I am not your team. He grinned. Sure. Keep telling yourself that. She scowled, but for once she didn't argue. Because, deep down she knew. She had chosen to stand beside him. And there was no going back. Syra had spent her life knowing exactly who she was. A auxiliary warrior, a soldier of an empire that never faltered, never hesitated, never retreated. That certainty had been her foundation, her purpose. It had carried her through the chaos of war, through victories won with blood, through losses suffered with silence. She had believed without question that her path was unchangeable. Until now. Now she was standing on the bridge of a human ship, watching the stars stretch into infinity, waiting for the inevitable. It had been 3 days since the mercenaries had backed down, 3 days since she had made a choice, and now her past was coming to claim her. Daniel stood beside her, hands resting on the ship's control panel, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to panic. Syra had come to realize that about him. He handled threats like an engineer handled a failing engine, calmly, methodically, without fear. But that didn't mean he didn't understand the stakes. Because out there, beyond the safety of the ship, auxiliary warship was approaching. Not a scout, not a mercenary crew, a warship. Syra didn't need the scanners to tell her why it was here. It was here for her. They're hailing us, Daniel said. She exhaled slowly. Put it through. The moment the transmission connected, a familiar voice filled the bridge. Deep, commanding, unyielding. Commander Syra. She didn't react. Didn't flinch. Admiral Vekas. The auxiliary admiral's face appeared on the screen, his expression as cold as she remembered. His armor was pristine, unmarred by battle, his golden eyes filled with the same ruthless discipline she had once admired. You are to surrender yourself immediately, he said. Your exile is over. The Empire has deemed you unworthy of abandonment. You will face judgment. Syra kept her posture rigid, unreadable. And the human. Vekas barely spared Daniel a glance. Irrelevant. Daniel let out a low whistle. Wow. Love the warm welcome. Syra ignored him. And if I refuse? The Admiral's expression didn't change. Then your death will be swift. A courtesy few are granted. There it was. The choice she had known was coming. Once she would not have hesitated. The auxiliary empire was her home. Her purpose, even death, if demanded, would have been accepted with honor. But she had not died. She had been saved. Not by her people. Not by the warriors she had fought beside. By a human. By someone who should have left her behind but didn't. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw. So, we talking escape plan, or are we just gonna sit here and hope they change their minds? Syra stared at the screen, at the cold, indifferent eyes of the admiral. He did not see her. He saw a duty to be fulfilled, a mistake to be erased. She had been one of them once, but no longer. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I will not return." Vickers blinked, slowly, as if he had misheard. Then his expression darkened. "You choose this. You choose him." Syra turned her head slightly, meeting Daniel's gaze. He wasn't afraid. Not of the warship, not of the Xylari, not even of the fact that he was one wrong move away from death. And for the first time, Syra saw it clearly. The Xylari were strong. Their empire was vast, their armies powerful, but they did not save their own. They left the weak behind. They discarded those who failed. Humans were different. Daniel was different. And in the end, that difference had saved her life. She looked back at the screen, her stance unwavering. "I choose myself." For the first time, Vekas's expression flickered, not anger, not disappointment. Disbelief. "You are lost," he said, almost quietly. "You are no longer Xylari." Syra's claws curled at her sides, but her voice did not waver. "Then I am free." Vekas's gaze hardened. "Then you will die." The transmission cut off. The warship began charging weapons. Daniel let out a slow breath. "All right. Well, that went about as well as expected." Syra's fists clenched. There was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. The Xylari ship was larger, more advanced, and heavily armed. A single direct hit would incinerate them. But Daniel was already moving. His hands flew over the controls, the ship's engines roaring to life. Syra moved beside him without thinking. "Weapons?" He grinned, despite everything, finally in the mood to help. She scowled. Less talking, more fighting. The ship lurched forward as Daniel sent it into a rapid descent, diving toward the planet's surface below. The warship followed, plasma turrets igniting the void with streaks of fire. Syra's heart pounded, her warrior instincts sharpening. This was not a battle she could win, not in a fair fight. But humans didn't fight fair. "Use the wreckage," she said, eyes locking onto the battlefield remains below. Daniel didn't need further explanation. He veered the ship sharply, weaving through the debris field, forcing the Xylari warship to adjust its trajectory. It was bigger, slower, less adaptable. Syra locked onto the weapons console, scanning the limited arsenal Daniel had. Not much. No heavy artillery. No missiles that could penetrate Xylari warship's shields. But she did have an idea. "Divert all power to the rear thrusters on my mark," she said. Daniel shot her a look. "That's a terrible idea." She bared her teeth in something almost like a grin. "Do it anyway." The Xylari warship was closing in, preparing for a final kill shot. Syra watched the targeting system, counting the seconds. Then, now, Daniel punched the thrusters. The ship jerked forward at impossible speed, straight toward the largest wreckage in the debris field. A massive, half-destroyed Xylari dreadnought, its core reactor still unstable. Syra fired the ship's only torpedoes, not at the warship, at the wreckage. The explosion was instant, a chain reaction of fire and plasma. The Xylari warship, too close to maneuver, slammed into the blast wave. Its shields flickered, overloaded. The impact sent it spiraling off course, its hull tearing apart against the wreckage. Syra exhaled. It wasn't destroyed, but it was disabled. And for now, that was enough. Daniel let out a breath of laughter. "You are terrifying." She smirked. "I learned quickly." The ship stabilized, leaving the battlefield, and the Xylari behind. For the first time in her life, Syra had no orders, no mission, no empire to serve. She was free. She turned to Daniel. "Where are we going?" He grinned, setting a course into the unknown. "Wherever we want."